in the product backlog. So this process diagram illustrates that when you have multiple teams, this is the way you want to make the team to manage their agile project with more scalability. You use the requirement on top of the product backlog, and sometimes you want to populate the product backlog by assigning the spec to each of the product backlog. The product backlog 1 is shared by the team 1 and team 2, and the product backlog 2 is dedicated for this agile team N. When the project is big, often indeed, you're going to have some teams dedicated or running for the purpose of making sure all the product components from multiple teams will be working properly. So how do you make the integration team to be working? How do you make sure the quality can be protected for a multi-team agile project? Well, you make sure each agile team will be running with quality considered. So you'll be testing for sprint, testing for the release sprint. Often you want to auto testing for each component. And you want to make the team to be responsible. So if you recall what we discussed yesterday, you're going to use the agile floaters to make each agile team to be more capable of testing. And if the agile floater is an investment by the QA organizations, then the big reward is all the team members of agile are more capable of testing, are more friendly to the QA test best practice guidelines. They follow such best practice guidelines to testing for their development sprint. Then the continuous integration team, one way to make them to be productive is to create user story and specs to purposely represent the work of the system integration effort. Now you have a challenge. We say a requirement spec and requirement epic really need to be end-user friendly. It needs to be small, 3 days, 5 days of work. That's easy for system integration. It has no difference than the other teams. But how do you make the system integration work, which often is pure technical, to be user-friendly? And I think development culture best guideline is a guideline, is a commitment of driving the way you think. And it proved to be productive and proved to be great, because otherwise, the founders and the real use of methodology enable the founder and the other people to continuously improve the product. So to some degrees, you just have to kind of commit yourself. That can be done. And then, of course, for SpecDD, since I'm a founder, one of the principles of method I stated when I found the methodology is, let's make the method to be open. Meaning, if you want to change the practice, that's all fine. For system integration work, you just happen to be, you belong to a company organization, you do not believe that the spec need to be specified to be end customer user friendly. But I want to share my experience. 2 years ago, we started to make DevSuite to be supporting multi-sites. meaning, you can deploy DevSuite for a big company where they have teams in different countries. We want to make DevSuite to be capable of hosting database server, application server, and web server at different countries, so that the remote team used to be accessing the data with the limitation of internet bandwidth will no longer have such limitations. The performance is always the local access performance. And it turned out to be such a work can be done at pure technical levels. And by committing this pure technical work to be done in a way of, since it's pure technical as has no really user interface, such function can be done to be user interface independent. Therefore, it frees us to be able to create layers at lower level so that auto-testing can be done, because there's no human being need to be involved to test such function for its scalability. But we also add a layer to represent such function to be all end-user value. It gains the end-user value for any of the functions at low level. So as a result, actually it helps us to be able to create a better testing procedures so that we can make the auto-testing to be done by the team who is working on the low-level DLLs for the multi-site support. In other words, the low-level multi-site support to some degree can be represented from a requirement spec of very more technical by having such a requirement to be connected with another set of requirements that brings value to the end users. Auto-testing can be done more connected with the user value gain specification requirement. So anyway, the integration team, such a module share the similarity of a low-level DLLs where you create spec and a story to enable the integration team or a low-level DLL team to break their work into specs and then to create stories to drive the integrations. Obviously, you want to, in order to make a multi-team work for testing the integration, you really need to make the testing to be integrated and deployment to be integrated, meaning the auto-building tools, auto-testing tool will be capable of taking the component delivery from each agile team and make them to be fully integrated and distributed into not only the integrated working software, but its related testing environment for the testing purpose. So we're going to do a training poll. So question number 1, what does the product backlog contain in SpecDD? It contains the accumulated defect from QA team, customers, and any members. It contains the staging stories and the tasks with the effort estimate yet to be assigned to the sprint backlog. It contains all the story once created but delayed. Okay, so we have 18% saying it contains all the accumulated defects from QA team, customers, and any members. This is the correct answer, because the product backlog, of course, you might have multiple product backlog. The defect submitted has no other place to go in a SpecDD but the product backlog. Unless you want to use a requirement to represent a defect. Some customers do. And then to me, it's no longer it's a defect. It's become an enhancement. So to some degrees, defects has no place to go but the product backlog. Second, it contains the staging, story, and task with effort estimate. That's correct answer too. Because you want to commit the requirement, but you want to estimate them first before assigning them directly to a sprint. How do you do it? Well, you have two ways. One is to create a future sprint. You put them there, and then you move them from a future sprint to the current sprint. Or the future sprint will become current sprint, meaning you are, as a product owner, you are already working on the next sprint. You are estimating the task. You are working with team members to ask them to tell you, give you your feedback. You start to break the story down into tasks. And then you purposely move some of the story elsewhere. Where do you move to? Well, you move to the product backlog. Third one, it contains all the stories once created but delayed. That's also correct answer in SpecDD. Meaning, for those stories, you say it's a commitment for this current sprint. But at the end of a sprint, 2 weeks later or 4 weeks later for some teams, you cannot finish the story. What do you do? Sometimes, yes, you can just move them to the next sprint, but often the priority becomes no longer high enough. You do not need to implement this story anymore. Well, for them, so once delayed, in a sense of, if it's not going to be the next current sprint, then it's delayed. Therefore, all the stories will be remaining in the product backlog. You can't put the story back to the requirement space, right? Because requirement, remember, only contains spec, epic, documents, ideas. It's more conceptual. It contains all the requirements to be defined. Well, that's not correct answer, actually. Well, you can say it contains the story that represent the fact that some of the requirements do not have the details and yet to be developed. But requirement can be representing some feature enhancement, new features that it's going to be considered 3 years later. It's not going to be in the product backlog. It's not a good idea to have the product backlog to contain too many requirements representing the features. In a SpecDD, it's not like a normal Scrum process where product backlog is the requirement. In a SpecDD, requirement exists on top of the backlog. Let's do one more question. Okay. Question number 2. This could be tricky. I purposely make some of the questions tricky. What is true about a requirement spec? It is a broken down requirement with end user value. Its time remain is a roll up from all stories and tasks. A story is a backlog item, but a spec is not a backlog item. A spec must be associated with test cases. A story must be with details before a child task can be finished. A child task means the implementation task, right? To implement a story, which represents an assignment of implementing a feature. So let's take a look.
Okay,
Wow.
we'll close the poll in about 5 seconds.
These questions are designed for you to kind of judge yourself. Are you sharp enough in terms of all these concepts and the methodology ideas. And I think, as I explained yesterday, based on my experience, learning methodology is more like learning ping pong game, learning sports, learning something like playing piano, playing violin. You know the theory, you know the knowledge. That's not good enough. You must pick up a lot of skill. You must practice it. Otherwise, you're not going to be a good pianist. Otherwise, you're not going to be an advanced ping pong player. You know, by rubbing the ping pong ball with a good pedal, it can create a spin and make the ball spin like crazy. So you're going to be winning. Well, it's easy to understand, but not enough for you to be able to do what you claim you can, and you know what to do. That same thing. That's why the question is like help you to make some self-judgment. So 30% first, 5%, 18%, 23, 18%. Okay. So it is a broken down requirement with end user value. Absolutely, that's correct. The time remaining of a spec is a roll-up from all story and task. To some degree, it's wrong, and it's also be correct. So if you think about a requirement spec that need to be assigned, if it's already finished, then this statement is true, right? Meaning, if it's already in the process of being implemented, then you will see a requirement spec that might have 3 stories. Each story has many, many tasks. As a team estimate the time remaining, you really know in order for this requirement to be finished, I still have 3 days time remaining. And that is from the roll-up of all the stories, all the active stories, and active tasks, right? A story is a backlog item, but a spec is not a backlog item. That's a correct statement. A story lives in backlog. A spec lives in requirement space. A story will be consumed, will be burned. It's become non-existing as it becomes working software. However, a spec always remains to retain the process intelligence related to a decision of accepting, adopting, improving, implementing, testing a requirement, but not a story. A story is a backlog item. A spec must be associated with test cases. Yes, and not necessary. A spec, if you want to perform testing in SpecDD, then a spec, yes, it should be associated with test cases. If a spec, it's only going to be used for driving development, then test cases is not needed. A story must be with detail before a child test can be finished. That's absolutely not correct. A story often only exists to drive the working software to be done. And the working software deliver actually will help you to revise, improve the requirement. So you sacrifice a few stories initially in order to create a prototype of the working software, which will be used to help you to understand the true nature of the requirement, and yet without driving the task, the child task, to create a working software. We won't have the luxury of a cool ideas, $1 million ideas, that it just cannot be fully understood. But we now, by creating a story with no requirement details, but we have a working software. Don't forget, a story represents an abstract of the idea, which has tremendous amount of value and market potential, but it doesn't necessarily need to be fully documented.